During this presentation, I will follow the structure of the dissertation and go through the main concepts and theories used in the research before saying a few words of the methods, and most importantly, I will present and discuss the empirical results that form the core of the thesis prior to concluding on the contributions, limitations, and perspectives. As an introduction, I have selected this excerpt from an opinion written by Manuel Albert in March of this year. And beyond stressing the harmful effects of the crisis we've been through for several months, these quotations illustrates the perpetual and inevitably intimate connection between labor and housing. You have undoubtedly noticed that for most of us, the relationship to the home has changed this last month. Many of us have been suddenly confronted with permanent telework, which can be assumed to have structural effects in the future. When I started doctoral research 4 years ago, the impact of home-based telework on housing design and urban development was precisely what I had planned to study. But soon I met different actors from the housing market who unanimously told me, the only thing you need to work from home is a laptop. You can work on your kitchen table, so why would you adapt houses for that? I would be curious to hear from them today. Anyhow, at that time, these responses inclined me to reconfigure my research topic. So I maintained the choice of studying the impact of the flexibilisation of labour markets on housing production and urban development, but I shifted my focus from the housing unit to the building and the block scales. Also, from the start, I decided I would study the influence of local context on this phenomenon by conducting a comparative analysis of Amsterdam, Brussels, and Stockholm. More specifically, the research was built upon 3 aims: conceptualize, understand, and inform. The first aim was to conceptualize what I call the live-work mix, and which I will briefly define next. From there, the second primary aim was to understand the how, and more specifically, how local context influence the nature of live-work mix and how live-work goals are implemented. The third aim was to inform planners, decision makers, and scholars to help them apprehend an emerging phenomenon that is likely to expand in the future. So let's delve deeper now into the conceptualization of a live-work mix, which may have looked intractable at some point, before introducing the theories underpinning this concept and the analytical framework chosen to address the research questions. Live-work mix can be defined as the renewed intertwining of living and working activities in housing production and urban development. I relate this concept directly to the definition of new target groups, the restructuring of housing provision and changes in urban agendas, and indirectly to the flexibilization of the labor market and the rise of the knowledge economy. And I will now say a few words about the 3 direct drivers. The first global driver of live-work mix relates to the fact that new housing and urban agendas pay particular attention to both young urban single professionals and knowledge workers. These groups are assumed to live and work differently, as it is illustrated in this picture retrieved from an investor's website. However, some of them do face precarious conditions on both housing and labor markets. In particular, young adults tend to stay for ever longer periods in rental and shared accommodations, but low-income households and families cannot always accommodate in such housing. And focusing on young professionals and middle to upper classes may raise gentrification risks. Moving to the second driver, namely shifts in housing provision, 2 notions are central here, that is, housing affordability and accessibility. Affordability is linked to the market dimension of housing as capital, whereas accessibility is bounded to the social dimension of housing as a service. The thesis examined the evolution of housing provision in terms of regimes. Hence, under Fordism, regulatory states decommodified housing, but with the shift to post-Fordism, housing was recommodified. Commodification can be related to seeing housing as an asset before its other uses. Then, during the finance-led regime that started after the global financial crisis, states created conditions for accelerated financialization and flexibilization of housing. And here, financialization refers to the increasing dominance of financial actors and markets in housing provision. So nowadays, many talk about a global housing crisis with housing shortages and decreased levels of affordability and accessibility. At the urban level, live-work mix is seen as a form of mixed-use development, which is positioned as a tool of urban densification. The latter has been encouraged to tackle demographic growth and stem urban sprawl. Both densification and mixed-use development are further advocated to attract knowledge workers and boost economic growth in a context of competitiveness. These principles take part in polycentric urban development based on a spatial economic discourse. Analysis of residential preferences recognize that high-quality living environments and amenities help retain workers. So many cities have developed attractiveness policies promoting urban amenities, new housing forms, and creative live-work environments. And all these developments have shaken local, global, institutional relationships and affected the governance of cities. From there, based on the research gaps highlighted in the literature, the three overarching research questions are the following. First, what are the different ontologies of live-work mix in contrasting institutional frameworks, and how are they influenced by housing and planning regimes as well as current urban agendas? Second, how is live-work mix implemented locally, and more specifically, what kind of governance arrangements make it possible? And third, how do local institutional frameworks influence the nature and governance of live-work mix, and how to improve it? The analytical framework selected to address these questions combines path dependency and collaborative governance. The path dependency approach was used to compare housing and planning regimes in the three cities, and broadly speaking, path dependency is based on the idea that what has happened at an earlier point in time will affect the possible outcomes of a sequence of events occurring at a later point in time. Then collaborative governance was selected to explore the governance of live-work mix and in particular the actors and their roles. Four categories of actors were considered: the state, the market, the third sector, and the community. In this research, the state, I'm sorry, I'll just interrupt myself for a second, but someone didn't mute his microphone and it's quite noisy. Thank you. So, I was talking about the actors of live-work mix. In this research, the state refers to public entities that depend on the local government, and the market encompasses private developers and investors. The third sector is an inherently hybrid actor which combines public and private interests. For example, the Dutch housing associations that are responsible for social housing provision are considered third sector organizations. And the community consists of small informal groups which can be involved in co-housing developments, for instance. In this approach, governance refers to a coordination process of actors, social groups, and institutions to reach goals discussed and defined collectively. The analysis of the actors was combined with the study of the instruments used to implement live-work goals. These include, for example, city plans and local instruments enhancing flexibility, as well as regulatory instruments fostering predictability. And generally speaking, public policy instruments are defined as technical and social devices which organize specific social relations between the public authority and its recipients based on the representations and significations they carry. The main consensus reached was studied for ongoing live-work developments based on the shared interests, discrepancies, and conflicts observed during the implementation process. And the outcomes were discussed for completed projects as regards to the live-work mix achieved, the balance of shared spaces and small dwellings, and the levels of affordability and accessibility. I will now briefly introduce the methods used in the research. And beyond a rational choice, the use of qualitative methods was also driven by a natural inclination to this kind of research. So basically, I decided to conduct an embedded case study analysis with 3 cities as main cases and 3 types of logarithmics as embedded cases. Several reasons motivated this choice, including the increasing use of comparative housing studies in path-dependent approaches, and also comparing cities enables to stress their active role in urban planning and development. However, comparative case studies can easily fall into descriptivism or universalism, which is why it was chosen to play with multiple case studies. The research was conducted in 2 phases. The first phase was based on exploratory interviews and documents analysis and focused on the policy analysis of each context. And then the second phase consisted of an in-depth study of projects in each city, sampled based on a typology of logarithmics. The semi-structured interviews conducted and the instruments analyzed were coded consistently with a pre-analytical framework, and the first results were presented and debated during feedback workshops in each city. Moving to the first part of the empirical research conducted at the city level, beyond the comparison of housing and planning regimes, the strategies promoting logarithmics were also examined, touching upon political initiatives and policy programs. But let's have a look at the evolution of housing and planning first. Firstly, the early planning directions observed in each city remained for decades, namely urban expansion in Amsterdam and Stockholm against suburbanization out of Brussels. In Amsterdam, active land policy and municipal land lease were established in the late 19th century, and since then, spatial planning and housing provision have been closely connected. The roots of the housing regime were enacted in the 1901 Housing Act, which formalized social housing. In contrast, Brussels has been marked by home ownership advocacy since the first Housing Act. The working class was fixed in the countryside in part through the extensive railway network, and Haussmannization policies led to destructive planning intervention in Brussels. Then the First World War was a turning point that was notably followed by the creation of the National Social Housing Agency and the development of garden cities such as Floreal on the photograph. Similarly to Amsterdam, Stockholm expanded through land purchase and leasehold. The municipal planning monopoly and the new Building Act transformed the municipalities into powerful planning actors. However, the Swedish social democratic housing regime really started when the tenants' union, the first cooperative, and tenant ownership were introduced in the 1920s. Then the Social Democrats developed the People's Home model and created the municipal housing companies. Secondly, although each city experienced specific critical junctures, the Second World War was a turning point everywhere. In Amsterdam, social housing became substantial after the establishment of the welfare state through massive housing development programs. Land annexations were also essential in the city expansion, but it's later on that 2 key instruments of logarithmics, the structural plan and the land use plan, were formalized. In Brussels, state intervention continued to promote home ownership and facilitate suburbanization, which had harmful effects for Brussels until the mid-1990s. Considerable infrastructure was also developed for the 1958 World Exhibition and to host EU institutions, and the Spatial Planning Act introduced essential planning instruments. As for Stockholm, municipal housing companies started providing housing for all after the war, and ABC mixed-use towns were developed. On the picture, you can see the example of Vällingby, which was built west of Stockholm with housing and workplaces articulated around the metro station and a shopping center. And in the early 1960s, the so-called Million Home programs was launched and translated into state support to to the development of 1 million housing units within 10 years in Sweden. Thirdly, each regime presented more or less significant patterns of reaction. While Amsterdam and Stockholm both reacted with flexibilization and commodification, Brussels' housing regime continued to promote homeownership. In Amsterdam, planning was decentralized and made more flexible after the 2008 crisis. Nevertheless, as from the 1990s, homeownership became the new priority, and housing associations were later restricted in activities and target groups. Besides, after the 1970s crisis, the city launched urban renewal policies and large-scale regeneration programs, both enhancing mixed-use development. This was the case, for instance, with the Eastern Docklands that were redeveloped as from the 1980s. In Brussels, subsidized homeownership was created at the end of the 1980s to improve access to housing for the middle class in the city. Then, after the creation of the Brussels capital region, urban revitalization policies were launched, but they were used opportunistically. Also, the two main regional planning instruments were created in the early 2000s. And finally, in Stockholm, the 1990s economic crisis triggered a radical change in housing provision through the decline of public rental housing to the benefit of tenant ownership, which has now become the dominant tenure form. And also the planning-led urban development regime shifted to contract planning and market interest prioritization. So overall, significant patterns of path dependency do exist in the three contexts, and those are particularly evident in Brussels when it comes to homeownership and suburbanization, and in Stockholm regarding the housing for all rational and urban growth. The Stockholm case illustrates well the concept of lock-in effects, given the difficulties the city has to adapt its institutional framework to the current housing crisis. And at the same time, Stockholm showed a strong reaction to the 1990s crisis, as I've just explained. In that respect, Amsterdam institutional path seems to have reacted sooner than Stockholm to external changes. Anyhow, these institutional paths inform today's labor mix strategies, as I will discuss next. The influence of path-dependent regimes is apparent at various levels. When looking at the actors of labor mix, it turns out that market interests prevail in Brussels and retain rising interest in Amsterdam and Stockholm. Also, the scale and density of new projects is higher in these two cities, which can be traced back to their post-war massive housing programs. Furthermore, the governance capacity of local planning authorities impacts the implementation of labor goals. But in Brussels, despite institutional fragmentation and complexity, new actors and instruments have arisen to improve urban governance. While in the two other cities, which were originally highly planned and regulated, they have been affected, as I've just said, by flexibilization and market orientation. Finally, the work component depends on local economic drivers and their spatial integration. However, in the three cities, live-for-work development is promoted to enhance attractiveness. And as a result, Brussels' ontologies overlap between innovation and production, while attractiveness is key to Amsterdam's ontology of live-for-work mix, and Stockholm's ontologies are torn between the housing crisis and competitiveness. To illustrate the previous statements, I will just say a few words of each city urban development strategy. So in Amsterdam, the 2025 urban agenda designates working living milieux where it promotes density and mixed-use development. This map shows the economic development areas defined. For example, the creative areas are mostly spread along the ring road, while the productive areas are located outside the inner city or across the River A. Making these redevelopment areas attractive for housing is a challenge, especially in post-war districts that are separated from the inner city by the ring road, which marks social divide. What about Brussels? Here, deindustrialization and internationalization have created socioeconomic issues that are tackled today with a productive city discourse. And this strategy is apparent in the regional development plan, which promotes densification and mixed-use development, just as in Amsterdam, but here in priority development sites that you can see in purple on the map, and in particular in the canal area in red. And so although not represented on this map, the development plan was also influenced by the creation of a new land use zone, the ZEMU, which allowed to open former industrial areas to housing development and productive activities. In Stockholm, the urban development strategy is encapsulated in the comprehensive plan, which focuses on urban growth through the definition of focus areas, strategic connections, and densification and expansion areas. And in the four focused areas, housing supply is encouraged together with amenities, services, and workplaces. And these housing supply goals are explicitly justified in the plan for their role in economic growth and attractiveness. The previous maps underline the definition of live-work goals in each city, but current issues inevitably interfere in the definition and implementation of these goals. For example, by supporting live-work mix for specific demographics, other groups are neglected in each city. This is well illustrated in Amsterdam, where new tenure forms were allowed to improve the accessibility to housing of students and young professionals, raising questions about whom to support in a context of generalized housing shortage. In Brussels, instruments such as subsidized home ownership indicate a prioritization of middle-income households. And in Stockholm, by encouraging tenant ownership, which generates higher and faster land revenues for the municipality than other tenure forms, the city de facto tends to favor higher income households. Furthermore, the growing pressure on the housing market has led to small dwellings in each city, especially in Amsterdam and Stockholm. And in Stockholm, despite past traditions to space sharing in cooperatives and collective housing, market pressure has led to the privatization of space, whereas shared housing has been increasingly observed in Amsterdam and Brussels. Finally, affordability and accessibility issues are addressed differently in each city, resulting in distinct tenure forms. Hence, in Brussels, live-work developments are likely to include subsidized home ownership in response to affordability issues, while in Amsterdam, short-term contracts are increasingly used to improve housing accessibility for young adults. And Stockholm develops standardized housing solutions to reduce construction costs, as well as temporary housing for young adults to tackle both affordability and accessibility problems. Proceeding now to the second phase of the empirical research, this part examined the governance of live-work mix and in particular the essential role of the state, about which Madden and Marcus said that the question will always be how the state should act towards housing, not whether it should do so. This part of the research focused on three types of live-work mix. The first one is the shared housing market, which refers to large-scale developments delivering small dwellings, aiming at the, with services and shared spaces used to work. Then the second type is live-work developments in targeted area, which consists of mixed-use projects that intertwine housing and economic activities at the building or the block level. And the third type corresponds to community-led housing with shared workspaces or economic activities. Starting with the shared housing market, one of its specificities is the development of small housing units in response to growing housing shortages. The pressure on size is well illustrated in the discourse of this architect who stressed that people are ready to accept smaller flats than before. What the comparison showed is that this market is further advanced in Amsterdam, where the second project studied included over 900 units of 24 to 40 square meters. However, in the three cities, this market is similarly developed in specific locations and primarily for young adults. And it is more likely also to develop during a crisis, as it was the case in Amsterdam. In all cities, the actors receive more or less active support from local governments. This was apparent in the discourse of planners, councillors, and project managers working for the municipality, who presented the projects as what they need right now and how the work is used. However, the coalitions of actors involved vary locally. In Amsterdam, they can involve housing associations and market parties, while the market acts alone in Brussels. And the Stockholm case illustrates another kind of partnership that is steered by a municipal housing company. The partnerships observed relied on shared interests and aligned means. For instance, in the Amsterdam cases, the actors combine their complementary abilities and investment capacities to deliver housing for students and young professionals. In addition, using new regulatory instruments is essential to implement these developments. State support is translated into the strategic use of planning tools, and the initiators of the project may benefit from new flexible 10-year regulations, which allow them to develop more flexible yet less secure housing. In terms of outcomes, the shared housing market seems to respond to young adults' interest at first glance. The findings also confirm the tendency for this market to deliver smaller units, although in Brussels, diversity is required in the dwelling typologies. Furthermore, shared spaces and services have the potential to enhance lived work mix and balance the concentration of small dwellings. As an illustration, you can see here on the slide the co-working space of the first Amsterdam projects, also the Sky Lounge in the Brussels project, where there was a meeting held on the terrace while the picture was taken. And on the third picture, you can see a freelance young adult working in the community room. But regretfully, shared spaces are often designed in residual spaces that are unsuitable for housing. This market also raises affordability and accessibility issues that vary across cities according to the spectrum that is represented here. So the Stockholm and Brussels cases were positioned as the two extremes of the spectrum, with Stockholm temporary housing for young adults reasonably accessible and affordable, whereas the Brussels shared housing market draws on a little regulated rental sector, and the Amsterdam cases are positioned in between. Moving to lived-work developments at the area level, these often draw on pilot mixed-use projects that either mix housing with functions that were separated before, or are the outcome of particular governance arrangements. For example, this excerpt shows that in Brussels, mixing housing with productive workshops requires new ways of designing and governing projects. As shows this figure, the comparative analysis indicates different paths in each city, which reflect divergences in ontologies of lived-work mix and in what the live and work components ought to be. Again, state support is essential, but varies locally according to planning regimes, so that in Brussels, institutional fragmentation required new actors to improve the collective governance capacity of the region. And in contrast, Amsterdam and Stockholm still centralize their resources, but they increasingly need the assistance from external consultants or intermediaries. Also, the involvement of the government architects in Brussels and Amsterdam projects confirms the need for design-oriented planning and the importance of high-quality design in lived-work developments. The market, on the opposite, remains reluctant to develop lived-work mix and rather focuses on the live component. Besides, developers and investors tend to focus opportunistically on easy target groups. Interestingly, no social housing providers were involved in any of the projects examined for this type, and there were also no municipal housing companies involved in the Stockholm cases. And although this observation would require further research, not collaborating with this type of actor made may again lead to overlooking lower income households. Regarding the planning into different projects, the actors established custom-made local visions, such as the Buurt visie in Amsterdam, and they used existing instruments strategically, such as the subdivision permit in Brussels. These choices illustrate variants of strategic planning with contract planning in Amsterdam and Stockholm, and incremental planning in Brussels. However, these instruments may conflict with existing regulations, and this was the case, for instance, with the planning permission in Brussels, which did not allow the flexibility required in the project study. Besides, early-stage collaboration triggered consensus building in the project. In Amsterdam, such collaboration drew upon the we need them and they need us rational, requiring to find a right balance of rules and flexible guidelines, as shows the planner's discourse. In particular, a shared interest in enhancing the residential attractiveness of the locations was observed. It could be an obsolete office area or an industrial deprived area. And the quotation here gives the example of an up-and-coming area in Stockholm that was previously industrial, but has progressively become a creative hub, raising the interest of housing developers. Nevertheless, discrepancies related to the nature of the live-work mix affected the planning process, especially in Amsterdam and Brussels, and in all cases, difficulties to achieve effective spatial planning were observed. Moving to the third type of live-work mix examined, co-housing developments are community-led initiatives which were here highly motivated by the need for affordable housing. So a resident in Brussels explained that she was told that with her saving, she could barely afford to buy a garage in Molenbeek. From the analysis based on two projects, respectively located in Amsterdam and Brussels, it turns out that the success of these developments relies on public support or the commitment of a third actor steering the group, as well as a cohesive and resilient community. In both projects, the residents were looking for large and affordable housing, but while the Amsterdam community built upon core values, in Brussels was divided. Specific instruments formalizing the group as a developer were needed, for instance, collective self-building in Amsterdam, but both projects missed the opportunity to make anti-speculative agreements. In the Amsterdam project, the affordability goals were reached and the shared spaces are extensively used, notably the theater that you can see on the left picture. However, live-work mix appeared to be hardly present, since only a few residents used their dwelling for their professional activity, despite it was a central goal in the initial project. On the opposite, in the Brussels project, little sharing was observed because the main communal areas are outdoor spaces, but live-work mix was well present, mainly in economic or converted lots. And finally, speculative behavior and community erosion were raised as concerns in Amsterdam and somehow verified in Brussels. What about Stockholm? Well, I could not find a recent live-work co-housing project despite emblematic collective housing estates developed in the past. And different reasons may explain this observation, including housing commodification, the absence of current financial support to community initiatives amidst a highly institutionalized planning framework. And this was all the more surprising, knowing that I lived myself during 3 months in an old cooperative. And this cooperative had all the ingredients of the projects I've just presented in Amsterdam and Brussels. It had several communal areas, including a community room, a shared garden. It had economic activities on ground floors and a preschool. Still, it seems that such properties are times long past in Stockholm. So in a nutshell, what can be said about the actors of live-work mix is that states, or here local governments, back all types of live work mix by facilitating to entrepreneurial roles and possibly developing unexpected governance capacities. Market parties tend to focus on housing developments, but their behavior varies depending on the type of live work mix. They may collaborate with third sector parties, revealing then mutual dependencies between these two types of actors. And only in co-housing development is the community involved and then formalized through specific instruments. The implementation of live work mix requires new planning instruments and strategic uses of existing tools. In particular, custom-made visions and specific instruments allow enhancing both flexibility and predictability. Consensus building practices were discussed at the area level. The actors seek to enhance the attractiveness of a specific location and target middle to upper classes by delivering certain tenure forms, but disagreements can affect this process. The different ontologies of live work mix observed in the three cities result in a productive city discourse in Brussels, a knowledge city discourse in Amsterdam, and an urban growth discourse emphasizing thematic economic development in Stockholm. The outcomes discussed for the shared housing market and live work co-housing indicate that both types of live work mix seem to meet the needs of their recipients at first sight, despite different expectations, at least as regards to size and flexibility. However, the delivered live-work balance tends to be in favor of the live side, and also insufficient or poor quality shared spaces can make small living hardly livable. In particular, the shared housing market delivers different levels of affordability and accessibility, so that housing as a service does not especially mean accessible housing. In response to these issues, the thesis makes some suggestions, including the systematization of anti-speculative agreements in co-housing developments, the definition of standards for shared spaces in building regulations, the importance of actors and instruments dedicated to the operation of the work component in live work developments, and the need to challenge the regulation of housing size in building standards, which is probably even more important in the current COVID crisis context. Before moving to the conclusion, I would just like to say a few words of the comprehensive discussion. This final discussion concludes on the influence of institutional frameworks on the nature and governance of live work mix for the cities and types selected and with the analytical approach chosen. In practice, the empirical results were reconnected with the conceptual framework. So firstly, we saw that a live work mix is purposed for specific demographics, which may result in overshadowing other household types. And all the actors involved share a responsibility in that issue. Besides, the digital nomads might become the next preferred target group, given the evolution observed in the shared housing market. Secondly, live work mix draws on the emergence of commodified housing forms, and that is particularly the case for the shared housing market, which exemplifies the role of housing as a commodified service. Moreover, the de-risking role of housing in specific locations has brought about live work buildings with joint property arrangements. Thirdly, live work mix is planned in locations that are prioritized in urban agendas, but the types of locations depend on local governance capacities, economic context, and planning regimes. From there, the various relationships between local institutional frameworks and the components of live work mix were outlined in the manuscript, and I will just give two illustrative examples here. The first connection relates strong planning regimes and institutionalized housing providers to higher density and smaller dwellings. Also, changing roles and interests for states and markets appear to impact the definition of target groups. And these examples confirm the decisive impact of the context on live work mix, even though global variables are influential as well. An illustration of that is the impact of global trends to co-living and micro-living on the development of these higher density of smaller dwellings. The thesis also provides suggestions to improve lived work mix, as I've just mentioned, and besides general advice to adopt complex and context-related strategies, the suggestions were reorganized in 3 axes. The diversity of target demographics, connected with housing size regulation, the provision of decommodified alternatives through the revision of building and tenure regulations, and the active involvement of non-profit housing providers, and the mitigation of density and attractiveness with livability and inclusiveness. For instance, by formalizing standards for shared spaces and reducing risks on the operation of complex or uncertain functions. Nevertheless, 2 warnings must be formulated here. Firstly, improvement measures are sensitive and they require the choice of appropriate variables. And secondly, these suggestions should be examined in the light of current and future crises, since they can create opportunities for institutional reforms, which can in turn lead to new crises. So to wrap up, I will recap the main contributions, which again relate to a particular conceptualization and analytical approach, and I will also stress the primary limitations and perspectives of the research. The contributions of the thesis can be found at different levels, and they include, at a conceptual level, the framing of the lived work mix concept itself. Then at the more theoretical level, the improved understanding of local regimes and their relationship to lived work mix, and also the increased knowledge about collaborative governance in institutionalist approaches. And finally, at the methodological level, the contributions include the choice of an embedded case study method with a sampling by city and by projects, and the combination of path dependency and collaborative governance. However, as in any research, the thesis obviously presents limitations, and the first one lies in the emerging nature of lived work mix, which makes it difficult to quantify and assess. Also, I did not include informal forms, and the methodological choices may have somehow limited opportunities for generalization. Fortunately, the thesis opens several perspectives for future research. The shared housing market offers various opportunities for housing studies. Besides, urban studies could investigate more in-depth the tendency for lived work mix to be coupled with a high-density living. However, I believe it is prospective research on the new forms of lived work mix that will emerge in the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis that should be conducted in priority, including research on the possible reconfigurations of housing under changing preferences and values, and the adapted role of shared spaces and especially workspaces in a new sanitary context. I thank you so much for your attention and most importantly for all these beautiful moments during the last 4 years.